Hello, good to be back with you today. I'm Michael McGovern once again, doing some more reading from When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi by Pulitzer Prize winner David Maraniss. Give him a plug. The book is definitely worth it. Grab it on Amazon, grab it at a local bookstore when applicable. But lockdown continues for all of us here in the Northwoods for today, and especially for our friends and neighbors in our retirement homes around the area. By the way, a lot of folks wound up sharing this video, and thank you very much for doing that. Just share it with whoever you feel would benefit from it, would like a little half-hour break a day to be read a story and hang out and have a little quasi-human contact here with the little one-way video. But a lot of really sweet comments on Facebook about it when we shared it on there. Feel free to subscribe on YouTube. That way you'll get the videos every day. And if you don't know how to do that, that's okay. Talk to one of the folks at the nursing home. Talk to one of the caregivers. They should be able to help you out with it. So, yeah, that's it. I'm very happy to be back with you. Well, we can chit-chat a little bit afterwards, but we like to dive right into the story here and get right to it. To recap what happened from last time, Vince Lombardi, growing up in the Brooklyn area, huge family. His mom wanted him to be a priest, so he wound up going to a Catholic, very, very Catholic sort of seminary situation for high school and college. And by the end of it, was got a great reputation as being a leader, but he still is just too hard to resist the dames, and even more too hard to resist possibly the even greater love of his life, football. We'll continue still in chapter 1. The cheaters. It's a bitter pill of age, isn't it? His timing could not have been better. The very summer that he went looking for a place to play football and win a college scholarship, in essence by repeating his senior year, St. Francis Prep was searching for boys like him. He had heard of the little school and even visited its crumbling yellow brick building on Butler Street because some of his Sheepshead Bay friends already went there. St. Francis, the oldest Catholic school in Brooklyn, was fighting to survive. At first, it considered dropping football, then set out on the opposite course, striving to make a name in football by almost any means necessary, handing out scholarships to gridiron talent all over the metropolitan area. Here could have been Exhibit A in the Cathedral essay about football's evils. Cathedral was Vince's former school. Many of the athletes St. Francis recruited did not meet its academic standards. With his good grades, Lombardi was an honorable beneficiary of a dubiously conducted recruiting enterprise. He was 19 years old, with 4 full years of secondary school behind him. The only reason he did not already have a high school degree was that Cathedral was a 6-year program. He was more mature than most of the boys he'd play against, a fact that would help him and his team. He took a $150 scholarship to St. Francis for tuition and books and signed on to play football. The sporting world tends to cling to the nostalgic belief that everything was simpler and cleaner in the old days. That is true in some ways, especially in the realm of money, but not completely. It is the fallacy of the innocent past. The sports of yesteryear might seem purer in retrospect because the larger culture keeps changing. Money increases, information comes faster, and sources of temptation multiply. But human nature remains essentially the same, no more or less pure from one generation to the next. Schools employed questionable methods to build winning football programs before Lombardi came along and after he left the game. Even as he followed a relatively straight and narrow path himself, the fallacy of the innocent past would be apparent throughout his career in football, starting at a desperate little Catholic school in Brooklyn. There was no practice field on Butler Street. The San Francisco boys trained for 10 days in August at Camp Alverno in Centerport, New York, which felt like the Ritz compared to what they'd had to endure once school began. Back in Brooklyn, they put on their pads and cleats at school, then clambered into an old bus and jostled through the borough to what passed for a field on the edge of Todd's shipyard along the East River waterfront. The skyscrapers of Manhattan soared in the middle distance. The field was actually a storage lot. a hazardous dirt yard littered with chunks of scrap iron that had to be cleared away. But if the conditions were difficult, the football was the real thing. Harry Kane, the coach, ensured that much. He himself had been recruited to bring glory to St. Francis. He was an esteemed schoolboy tactician who had made his name coaching football and baseball at the High School of Commerce, where, as he never stopped reminding later players, he had once instructed Lou Gehrig, the immortal Iron Horse of the New York Yankees. Kane was the prototypical football autocrat, a short bowling ball of a man with gray hair and a high-pitched voice who knew what he was doing and dismissed any alternative ways of proceeding. No patting on the head with Harry Kane. What he demanded of his players was undivided attention and commitment to winning. On the way back from the shipyard after a sloppy practice, furious at the way his boys were behaving, Kane shouted, "Stop the bus!" Sorry, that was a high-pitched. I said, "Stop the bus!" Not that high-pitched, and ordered his players off, forcing them to walk the rest of the way back to Butler Street. It was a moment that Lombardi would recall with delight later, telling it to his own players when they complained that he was too unforgiving. When the year started, Kane's top assistant, Tut Maggio, kept an eye on Lombardi, noticed the way he hit people, and thought he should be moved to the line, which Maggio coached. Interior linemen who stood 5'8" and weighed 175 pounds were not undersized then. Vinny wanted no part of the move. He survived the scare, playing in the backfield on offense as a spinning fullback whose primary function in any case was to block, running only in short yardage situations. There was another fullback on the team, a muscular, pug-nosed Irish kid with stunning speed, all light hair and laughter, who Lombardi realized had twice his own talent, but none of his determination. Vinny played. The gifted slacker mostly sat. Though he was there for only 1 year, a ringer of sorts, Lombardi became a popular student at St. Francis. He was called the class Floyd Gibbons, thought of as a bold adventurer. His smile left the greatest impression. Quote, "Lombardi is famous throughout the school for his smile that only seems to become bigger under adverse circumstances," the San Fran yearbook said of him. Quote, "You must not think, however, that Lombardi's smile is like those ordinary ones that some people seem to wear eternally merely to appear pleasant, and with which they mask their true feelings. Lombardi can no more help smiling than the sun can help shining." The San Fran writer misunderstood young Lombardi, assuming that the smile reflected his inner happy nature. People in Vinny's family knew that he was more complicated than that. The smile was also a product of the nervous energy and anxiety that drove him. The St. Francis football team won 5 of 6 games that year on its way to the mythical Catholic school title, defeating both Brooklyn Prep and Brooklyn Tech, and Lombardi, on the field for almost every down, performed well enough to gain some all-city recognition. He had his own intense rooting section of Izzos and Lombardis at every game, led by the tattooed Harry, his dad, who lit up a lucky strike before the kickoff for good luck. But the most telling moment of the season for Vinny came at the conclusion of an early game against powerful Erasmus Hall, a public high school then in the midst of a long winning streak. Led by the golden arm of its crackerjack quarterback, Sid Luckman, Erasmus shut out St. Francis 13-0. Yet Lombardi, who smacked Luckman with a few good licks on defense, felt like anything but a loser when it was over. He experienced what he later described as a locker room epiphany. As he sat, slumped on the bench in his grass-stained red and blue uniform, he was overcome by joy, a rare feeling for him. Nothing on the sandlots quite felt like this. He understood that he was not a great player, but he had fought hard, given his best, and discovered that no one on the field intimidated him, no matter how big or fast. He was confident, convinced that he could compete, puzzled why other players did not put out as much as he had. He felt fatigue, soreness, competitive yearning, accomplishment, and all of this, he said later, left him surprisingly elated. Work and play. It was an intoxicating sensation, one that he would want to experience again and again for the rest of his life. It's the end of a long chapter 1. Good intro to Vince. Grabbing a sip of water. As I mentioned before, this isn't an audiobook. This is just me coming in and spending time with you and reading to you while we're all in lockdown craziness. Thank you. And we don't go over 30 minutes, by the way. So, in case you're like, when is this guy going to shut up? It'll be in about 20 minutes. Chapter 2, Fordham Road. New York City once was the place to play college football. During the 20s and 30s, 3 schools there, Fordham, New York University, and Columbia, all had major programs that attracted the best teams in the country to the Polo Grounds and Yankee Stadium. Their contests on autumn Saturdays were held in front of thunderous crowds and covered by the most influential sports writers in America, who competed in prose and poetry to glorify the college game in more than a dozen metropolitan daily newspapers. When he accepted a scholarship to play at Fordham in the fall of 1933, choosing it over Columbia, Lombardi remained in New York, but he was a long way from home. The campus on Rose Hill was about as far from Sheepshead Bay as one could get within the city, 44 miles from the bottom of Brooklyn to near the top of the Bronx. The trip by public transportation took an hour and a half of riding subways through 3 boroughs, above ground on the BMT's Brighton Beach line from Avenue U to Newkirk Avenue, down under Prospect Park to Myrtle Avenue, up in daylight again to rumble over the East River at Manhattan Bridge, and back in darkness as the 6th Avenue line rolled north under the west side of Manhattan and the Bronx on the way up to the Grand Concourse. At the end of that trip came a half-mile walk down Fordham Road to the school's front gate. Vinny's cousin, Richie Izzo, who had arrived at Fordham a year before him and had helped persuade him to enroll there, made that commute every day. Like most of the men of Fordham, Richie was a day hop, as commuter students were called. Many day hops traveled by train and subway from Brooklyn, Queens, and outer Long Island. Another contingent hitchhiked or drove down in carpools from Westchester County. Ed Quinn, who inherited an old Ford from his aunt, took a group of 4 guys in from New Rochelle, often with just enough gas to reach the Bronx Zoo. In those days, they could abandon the car in the middle of the street. Quote, "We wouldn't even push it to the curb," Quinn recalled, and hustle up the sidewalk to make their 9 o'clock class, certain the car would still be there late in the afternoon when they returned with a canister of gas. Some day hops found their way across the Hudson River from New Jersey. Orville Leddy took the train down from Bergenfield to Weehawken and then rode across to Manhattan on a ferry before shuttling north on the subway. And one of the 432 men in Lombardi's freshman class, Wellington Mara, whose father later owned the New York Football Giants, was occasionally seen riding up from his family's luxurious residence at 975 Park Avenue in the back of a chauffeur-driven limousine. Lombardi was among the lucky few spared the daily grind. There were no day hops on the football squad. Most of the players were recruited out of the factory towns of New England or Pennsylvania coal country, but even the few who came from the New York area were given room and board on campus. They were an elite within the school's boarding elite. Many of them, like Lombardi, had attended prep schools for a year or 2 after high school and were not only bigger but older than their classmates. They roomed on the same floors of Dealey or St. John's Halls. In alphabetical order, Lombardi's roommate was Jim Lawler, a tackle from Astoria, Queens. They ate steaks and lamb chops together at the training table. They walked the campus in athletic brigades and played pool together in Dealey's smoke-filled recreation room. The first memory many teammates retained of Lombardi was of an incident at the pool table. He was leaning over to make a shot during their first week on campus, and someone goosed him. The pool cue flew across the table, and he turned around with a look that warned everyone that here was a serious fellow. The Fordham campus and its surroundings seemed isolated from the grit of the metropolis. A calming preserve of natural beauty extended from the world-famous zoo to the New York Botanical Gardens and onto the school property itself. 70 acres of cobblestone paths, gray stone Gothic buildings, and rolling greenswards shaded by graceful elms. The faculty of Jesuits, robed in full-length black cassocks, strolled the paths of the quadrangle, carrying missals and saying their office. The athletic director, Jack Coffey, prided himself on memorizing the birthday of every student. "Hello, June 11th, he chirped upon greeting young Lombardi. The campus was so evocative of academic serenity that it was a favorite choice for collegiate movie scenes. There was some clanging in the center of it all, where construction had begun on Keating Hall, But the noise was greeted as a sign of vitality, the majestic frontispiece of Keating riding skyward as a symbol that Fordham, founded in 1841 as the first Catholic institution of higher learning in the Northeast United States, was flourishing, even amid the economic hardship of the Depression years. The Jesuits sought to impose strict discipline on the men who lived there, and Lombardi mostly accepted it. From his sparely furnished freshman room on the 5th floor of Dealey, high-ceilinged with a creaky wooden floor, he awoke each morning at 6:30, dressed in coat and tie, put on his maroon-bowed miraculous medal depicting the Blessed Mother, maroon-bowed, I should say, and followed the path to chapel for daily mass before breakfast and class. He had few options in his coursework. Like many football players, he studied business administration, but only 3 courses separated that major from most others. All undergraduates essentially followed the same curriculum. The Jesuits favored ratio studiorum, which emphasized the retention of knowledge in the first 2 years and an integration of that knowledge into a spiritual philosophy in the final 2. Freshmen were loaded down with as many as 8 courses per semester, while seniors had only 4, with an increasing emphasis on philosophy, psychology, religion, and ethics. All Fordham men were expected to have an acquaintance with classical languages, which Lombardi already had fulfilled by taking Latin and Greek at Cathedral and St. Francis. At Fordham, he studied French. There was no sleeping in or skipping class. Attendance was mandatory, and tests came unceasingly. The Reverend Joseph Asmuth, S.J., biology professor for underclassmen, perhaps seemed inimitable, yet he was representative of the Jesuits who instructed Lombardi. Most of them had idiosyncratic touches. All were demanding. Asmuth was considered a world authority on termites. Students could not chew gum in his class. Quote, "That is for cows," he would proclaim in his German accent. Quote, "We don't chew." He did not use his textbooks, but scrawled everything on the blackboard for students to take down, essentially creating a textbook over the course of the year, and he kept everyone anxious. One never knew which day of the week he would stride in and bellow, "Blitz!" as assistants passed out the dreaded surprise quiz. After classwork and football practice, Lombardi was expected back in his room no later than 8 on weekdays, with lights out by 10:30. The Jesuits conducted room checks. To demonstrate their obedience, Lombardi and Lawler stepped out into the hall, fell on their knees, and uttered their nightly prayers. On weekends, the boarders could escape the campus but had to return by 11, midnight for upperclassmen, and report to the residence hall prefect or dean of discipline, Father John W. Tynan, S.J., Black Jack, the students called him, on the way back to their rooms. John Barris, one of Lombardi's classmates, thought that it was, quote, "just like a monastery up there. They locked the gates. They wouldn't let you out. Everything was a sin. You had this stuff drilled into you." But football players often exhibit split personalities, willing to exist in an authoritarian environment, yet always looking for small ways to rebel. In their first weeks at Fordham, some freshman ball players learned how to sneak from room to room by climbing out the window and moving along the ledge while clinging to the mansard roof. Later, many of them, including Lombardi, discovered they could fool the Jesuits, who checked their breath for alcohol at night by chewing garlic cloves after drinking. It took only 1 day of practice for the new head coach at Fordham to decide that his young recruit from Brooklyn was not going to become a backfield star. James H. Crowley watched Vinny Lombardi play fullback that opening day, then motioned for freshman coach Ed Hunsinger to come over. "Too slow," said Crowley. "Switch the kid to the front." The next day, Lombardi was playing guard. He was frustrated by the move and had difficulty adjusting from the upright position of a fullback to the three-point stance of a lineman. His hip pads bothered him. Nearsighted and colorblind, he complained about what he saw up there on the line. The opponents looked too close to him, separated only by the width of the ball, but he became a guard. That move of positions from fullback to guard, in one sense, marked the starting point of the mythology of Vince Lombardi. But the context of the Lombardi myth goes back another generation, to an earlier story involving his coach, Jim Crowley. There is a remarkable circle of coincidence in Lombardi's life that began long before he had ever heard of the place, in the small northeastern Wisconsin city of Green Bay. That is where Crowley launched his own football career. He was the backfield star of the 1920 Green Bay East High team that won the state championship when he threw 4 touchdown passes in the decisive game against Green Bay Wests. The precision of his spirals aided by a deformed pinky finger on his right hand, which he said helped him better steer the ball. His first high school coach, Earl Curly Lambeau, a local athlete who dropped out of Notre Dame and was also starting up a new professional team back home called the Green Bay Packers. At Lambeau's suggestion, Crowley left Green Bay to play for Knute Rockne at Notre Dame. There he became known as Sleepy Jim, a nickname that perfectly captured his appearance. His whole physical manner suggested relaxation. His ambling gait, his lazy hair parted down the middle, his tired, droopy eyes. It was Rockne who had coined the phrase by describing his recruit as, quote, a sleepy-eyed lad who looked as though he were built to be a tester in an alarm clock factory. But Crowley's drowsy aspects disguised a quick wit. To the question of why he seemed so sleepy, he explained deadpan, quote, I sleep all right at night and in the morning, but in the afternoon I toss and turn something awful. On the practice field at South Bend, Indiana one day, Rockne, who was called the Swede by his players, lashed out at Crowley for missing a blocking assignment. Quote, is there anything dumber than a dumb Irishman? Asked the coach. From Sleepy Jim came the dry retort, quote, yeah, coach, a smart Swede. I'm Irish. Sorry. That's pretty good. Crowley was not just sleepy and funny, he was also a character in American mythology by the time he reached Fordham. He'd been brought to fame in part by his own running skills, but more by the facile work of a publicist and the melodramatic prose of the greatest mythmaker in American sports, Grantland Rice, who over the course of a half-century wrote more than 22,000 stories and 7,000 poems celebrating athletes and their games. Crowley played left halfback at Notre Dame in a backfield that included Don Miller, Harry Stuldreher, I think I butchered that name, sorry, and Elmer Layden. The quartet, gritty and undersized, their average weight only 164 pounds, started 22 straight games from 1922 to 1924, losing only once. The 15th game in that streak came against a top-rated Army team at the Polo Grounds on October 18, 1924. Rice covered the contest amid the brotherhood of New York sports writers in the press box, and in loose conspiracy with a sports information man for the Irish, he transformed Sleepy Jim and his backfield mates from mere mortals into football legends, the 4 Horsemen of Notre Dame. On the Wednesday before the game, back in South Bend, the Notre Dame players had traipsed over to the Recreation Center in Washington Hall for their ritual road trip Eve movie. Playing on the screen that night was The 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, a 1921 silent film starring Rudolph Valentino and based on the mythical book of the same title, written by Vicente Blasco Ibáñez. It was a story of greed, hedonism, honor, love, and war set in Argentina and France before and during World War I. In the movie's pivotal scene, the Valentino character encounters a Christ-like prophet known as the Stranger, who foresees, quote, the beginning of the end, the coming of world conflagration, and invokes the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from Revelation. They appear as horrifying apparitions on horseback, the helmeted conquest, the hideous war, then pestilence, carrying the scales of famine, and finally the pale rider on the pale horse, death. George Strickler, the Notre Dame public relations man, said he, quote, got goosebumps watching the scene where the 4 horsemen, after appearing one by one, join together and thunder across the screen. The image stayed with him all the way to New York on the train. At halftime of the Army game, as he stood in the press box gossiping with a group of writers that included Grantland Rice and Damon Runyon, he mentioned that the Irish backs were running through the Army defense, quote, just like the horsemen. The next morning, when he leafed through the Sunday edition of the New York Tribune, he realized that Rice had appropriated his idea for what would become the most famous football lead ever written. Quote, Polo Grounds, New York, October 18th, 1924. Outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the four horsemen rode again. In dramatic lore, they are known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Stuhlderer, Miller, Crowley, and Leyden." End quote. Strickler's work was not finished. After reading Rice's account, he called his father in South Bend and arranged for him to rent 4 horses from a corral next to his saloon. At the first practice session after his team's return from New York, photographers were led onto the field to snap the picture of a publicist's dreams. Stuhlderer, Miller, Crowley, and Leyden on their mounts, wearing helmets and fearsomely stylish warm-up coats. The shot was distributed nationally. Above the cut line, "The Four Horsemen of Notre Dame." That phrase and the symbolism of the photograph combined to denote something beyond the prowess of a talented college backfield. All the elements were there for a new myth born from the old. The leathery men on horseback not only summoned the allegorical riders of the apocalypse from the book of Revelations, they also connected football to something that had nothing to do with the movie, but everything to do with the photographic image, the mythology of the American Wests. Swift justice and thrilling violence, the unambiguous world of black hats and white hats, valor and perseverance on the unspoiled plain, all that seemed endangered by the advent of the modern age. But here, within the 100 yards of a football field, was another way to play out America's enduring national myth, the freedom of the frontier. The Old West might be disappearing, but the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame rode on in the nation's romantic imagination, in league with the silent westerns then being filmed in Hollywood, yet with a more powerful combination of sports, legend, and memory. High on horseback, invincible, Stuhlderer, Miller, Crowley, and Leyden became honorable warriors of a lineage that reached deep into the national narrative, as eternal and illusory as knights of the Middle Ages. Their power in the sporting imagination, like that of medieval knights, arose from the contradiction of the heroic dream described by Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, whose seminal work on the legends of chivalric knights was published contemporaneously with Grantland Wright's rendering of the Four Horsemen. Quote, "Reality continuously denies the ideal," Huizinga noted, forcing culture to withdraw, quote, "further and further back into the sphere of festival and play." Jim Crowley brought the mythology of the horsemen with him to Fordham a decade after leaving Notre Dame. On the first day of practice, when he encountered Vince Lombardi and decided to move him to guard, he unwittingly provided the connection from past to future, from one myth to the next. That's where we'll stop today. Finally getting into some football here after a lot of time hanging out in Brooklyn and then in the high school seminary experience for Vince Lombardi on his path. Thanks so much for joining once again. I hope you're well. Again, by staying inside and social distancing and quarantining, we are doing our best to keep everyone safe, especially our more senior neighbors. So thank you for distancing and staying in. Again, this radio station, it's like one other person here. We social distance, and the DJ life is effectively, when people ask me to describe what being a radio DJ is like, I say it's like being in a room for 8 hours talking into a sock. That's pretty much it. And we all have our own socks, so we're fine. So don't worry about that. Okay, back again tomorrow. It was great today. We'll see you tomorrow for the next part. Bye-bye, and thanks very much.